That document, the Constitution, spells it out. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people peacefully or peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So, although free speech can ruffle feathers, it is a constitutional right. But with rights come responsibilities and some restrictions. For instance, you cannot incite lawless action or violence, nor are there protections for speech that constitutes a direct, serious threat to harm someone. Yet lately, threats of violence have been increasing. Last week, North Carolina Senator Thom Tillis released recordings of death threats that he has been receiving.
I might drive to North Carolina and shoot him dead in the streets like the dog he is.
That's just one of the calls to Senator Tillis, and he is not alone in receiving them. Both candidates in the still unresolved race for a seat on the North Carolina State Supreme Court have gotten them. The U.S. Marshals Service says threats to federal judges are increasing, with some being singled out on social media. And as our political divide deepens, this rhetoric grows louder, more threatening, and more frequent. Is this phenomenon new? Just how dangerous is it? In this age of declining civility in our politics and among our politicians, are citizens simply getting in on the act? We spend this hour talking about the limits of free speech. Bill Marshall is a professor of law at UNC Chapel Hill. David Enrich is a business investigations editor at the New York Times, but author of the recently released book, Murder the Truth: Fear, the First Amendment, and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. And Danielle Battaglia is Washington correspondent for the Raleigh News and Observer. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome.
Good morning.
Morning. Danielle, I'm going to start with you as the Washington correspondent for the News and Observer. Your paper posted some of the other recordings of threats to Senator Thom Tillis recently, and I want to share just three pieces of the milder ones that you posted, and then we can talk about them.
Yeah, Thom Tillis, afraid of death threats. Then get the out of office.
If I didn't have a broken back in Southern California, I would spend the rest of my life in federal prison for a chance to cut your throat.
I suggest, well, you're going to have to be very careful about going out in public or talking to anybody that's real, that's an actual American, because we hate you.
Danielle, why did the senator choose to release these tapes?
I'm actually curious about that myself, and I think there are several layers to that question. There were discussions about him not appearing at a town hall that was not created by him or the Republican Party, and there was a lot of backlash being directed at him for not appearing. And so what his staff said was, why do you expect him to appear when we're getting these death threats? He also got some pushback on recent votes he made on different members of Trump's cabinet, and it was reported that he was receiving death threats, and that's why he made the votes he made. So I could see it twofold of trying to say, I get death threats all the time. It wasn't about that, but also I don't want to appear at these town halls when I'm being threatened by my constituents. I'm not sure it was in his best interest to report these. My understanding is whenever you put out these death threats, they increase. And so I know Capitol Police was really hesitant about him putting these out and talked to me about it, saying they weren't a fan of this taking place.
That was going to be my next question. Did he not fear that by putting them out, he would be giving ideas to people who might be copycats?
I feared it for him. I don't think he is one that seems to care about I don't want to say his safety, but he did not seem to be concerned about that. He said like death threats are like going to 7-Eleven and buying a gallon of milk. It happens all the time, and it's not anything new that he's facing.
These were, as I said, some of the milder ones that I could find, and the ones that you could understand, because many of the less mild ones are bleeped to a fare thee well, so you can't understand anything but "an" and "thee." You've heard them all.
I've heard them all, and I've heard them uncensored.
How much worse do they get?
They get pretty graphic. Trying to make this make sense for the radio, but the words that my mother probably does not know were included in these threats, and then, talking about not only hurting the senator, but his kids and his grandkids. And they were talking in detail about how they plan to harm each of them. It gets pretty graphic.
Yeah, the senator put out a written statement to your paper. He said that his staff, even his family, have been subject to threats, harassment, attempted intimidation, verbal abuse from unstable individuals who don't agree with his political views. You cover Congress. How many other members of the House and Senate are subject to these same kinds of threats to the virulent level that he's been subject to them?
Without getting into details, so I am considered a staff member of Congress because I work there every day. So I am actually trained myself on getting threats and what to do about them. So this is not uncommon. And we've got the statistics. Capitol Police puts out statistics on threats every year. So 2021 was their all-time high. It was 9,625 threats. 2024, we saw 9,474. So that's a slight decrease, but not by a whole lot. So this is not uncommon. And those are the ones that have been reported or that Capitol Police have seen in the public sphere and have been able to go out and look at. That doesn't take into account ones that haven't been reported to Capitol Police.
As I mentioned in his statement, Senator Tillis seems to attribute these comments that we played, some of which we played, to unstable individuals. That's a quote. But his communications director, Danielle, suggested the media should ask Democratic-leaning groups whether they are contributing to these threats. Was he asking for an investigation or making an accusation?
I would say he's making an accusation there.
Bill Marshall is with us. He's a professor of law at the UNC Chapel Hill. Not all of these callers threatened bodily harm of Senator Tillis, though most did engage in profanity, which had to be bleeped for broadcast and for posting on the News and Observer website. If you eliminated the portion of those calls which involve a threat of bodily harm, could all of them be considered protected communications under the First Amendment?
Yeah, the profanity doesn't make it unprotected, and there is a category of speech that the court says is not protected by the First Amendment. You alluded to it earlier, Mike. It's called a true threat, and in order for there to be a true threat, there has to be an intent by the communicator, to instill fear in the receiver, and a reasonable person would have to perceive that that threat is serious. So without the threat of bodily harm, that wouldn't come into this category of true threats.
So to be clear, if you make a verbal threat or you put it in writing and send it to somebody, anybody, doesn't matter whether they're in Congress or not, you then lose the protections provided by the Constitution for free speech?
Again, if it's serious, if it's a serious intent to communicate and intent to commit an act of violence, if it is hyperbole or if it is a joke or perceived at that will be protected. But if it's a serious attempt to communicate an intent to commit bodily harm, and a reasonable person would perceive it as a serious attempt to indicate that you're going to instill bodily harm, then it's not protected by the First Amendment.
How do you determine intent?
Yeah, well, that's one of the difficulties in prosecuting these crimes, and it's why it's difficult to prevail on these. You have to show real intent. The example you had earlier of somebody calling in from California who said that they couldn't get back there, that's not a real threat because it indicated right there in the statement itself that he wasn't going to actually commit the act, that he would like to, but that itself wouldn't be a threat. It would have to be something that comes a lot closer to something that is believable and expresses a serious intent. I mean, I think some of the statements that were made against Senator Tillis, including that they were going to get his wife and kids, comes up probably pretty close to that level.
Politicians and their words and actions have always inflamed passions in those who take exception to what they're doing or saying or thinking. Are things worse today, do you think, than they used to be? Or are we simply more aware of it because of social media and other avenues of communication? Or is it just easier because of those avenues of communication to make these threats?
All three of the above. I think that people made these maybe privately before, but social media provides a wide range of way that they get disseminated so everybody hears it. As Danielle indicated before, it's somewhat contagious. When you start hearing some of these threats, it leads to other people making threats.
Because the gatekeepers have come down with social media, Danielle. I'm sure people used to make threats and send them in letters to the editor, to your newspaper, but your newspaper wouldn't print them, or they would edit them, redact them heavily. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I've received death threats that you all will never know about. And they came through email, they came through letters. You know, we don't always discuss what we get, and that's because we don't want to inflame it. Sorry to my editors if I just did.
I think anybody in the public eye today has gotten some sort of threat for something or another. I was told by a listener once that I should be careful what I say because I'm just a speed bump in the road to progress. We're talking about free speech and its limits this morning on Charlotte Talks on WFAE. David Enrich is with us. He is the author of Murder, the Truth, Fear, the First Amendment, and A Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. It's a brand new book. You're coming from free speech in that book from a different angle than what we're talking about. We've been talking about citizens and grievances with lawmakers and expressing them in very strong, often profane and threatening ways. You're talking about moves to curtail freedom of speech when it attacks those in power. Through your title, are you saying that those efforts, mainly on the right, are an attempt to take down free press and therefore murder the truth? Is that where the title comes from?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And just to be really clear to listeners, and the speech that you played clips of and that Danielle's been talking about, no one is arguing that that kind of speech, when you're making a real threat to someone, should be protected. The speech that I'm talking about in my book is speech that anyone from a journalist at a place like the New York Times to an independent blogger or someone with a Substack newsletter to just a citizen who wants to circulate a petition or write a negative restaurant review might write. And the rights and ability of people like that to do so without worrying that if they say something that upsets someone powerful, that they're going to get sued into oblivion. And the kind of the focus of the book is how there is a years-long and increasingly sophisticated and successful campaign, primarily on the right, but not entirely on the right, to make it much harder for people, journalists, community groups, activists to engage in that kind of speech without worrying that an honest mistake or a kind of a factual slip up could really jeopardize their ability to keep speaking and to even exist financially.
I mean, there are attempts on both sides of the aisle, I guess, to tamper down on people's speech. In this case, what you're writing about is the powerful people targeting the media. But there are people on the left who have targeted other aspects of our culture, like comedians, the cancel culture that Bill Maher talks about a lot. And I want to talk about, when we come back from the break, how that differs from what you're talking about here. And is it two sides of the same piece of paper? We'll do that when we come back. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE. It's Charlotte Talks on Listener Funded 90.7 WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about the limits of free speech and attempts to limit free speech on the part of some in our culture today with Bill Marshall. He's a professor of law at UNC Chapel Hill. Danielle Battaglia is Washington correspondent for the Raleigh News and Observer. And David Enrich is a business investigation editor for the New York Times, but also the author of Murder, the Truth, Fear, the First Amendment, and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. And in that book, you talk about how some people are using this to tamp down on free speech by threatening the press, for instance, with lawsuits, which some institutions have capitulated to, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, and what that means for free speech. But aside from targeting the media, how does this differ? How do these efforts on the right differ from efforts on the left, which have been referred to as cancel culture? You can't say certain things or we will simply cancel you. How does it differ?
Well, I think there's a really big fundamental difference, which is that the people on the left who are engaging in kind of that censorious language and trying to cancel people, those are private citizens or maybe people with big social media followings, things like that. But what we're seeing on the right are people who often are holding government positions or positions of great power in our society. It's often people with enormous amounts of money, billionaires. It's often major companies that have secrets to hide, whether it's about their misconduct or their executives' misconduct. And it's people in positions of great political power. And it is not a secret that Donald Trump and his allies have made great sport out of bashing the media over the years, which is fine. What has increasingly been happening is they've been moving those attacks into the legal sphere and political sphere as well, and really taking concrete actions, whether it's through litigation or policy changes that are designed to reduce the ability of journalists and everyday citizens to speak truth to power. And again, I want to emphasize that, I'm sitting in the New York Times building right now. And lots of people hate the New York Times, and that's fine. But this affects the rights of everyone, whether they're a journalist or not, to speak freely and criticize people or investigate people who hold positions of power, not just at the national level, but the community level as well. And my book tells the stories of people who speak up against like a local real estate development that is doing something they don't like in their town. They risk getting sued into oblivion, because even with the legal protections we have today, and things like that would happen a lot more frequently if this conservative movement to undo a lot of the constitutional protections we have, if that gains traction or ultimately succeeds.
In the opening paragraphs of your book, you write, quote, "I tried to talk to everyone who was featured in these pages. A few told that I was working on a book about legal threats and intimidation, threatened to sue me." Did they realize that they were making your case for you?
I don't know. That's something that baffled me at the time and continues to perplex me a little bit. I mean, this is something we're fairly accustomed to at the Times. I think many journalists all over the country have grown accustomed to receiving these threats. And what I thought was really notable, though, is that this is not just a phenomenon happening to investigative reporters at a big newspaper. This is something that is happening all over the country. And it's often happening to people who are just have a newsletter or their own podcast. It's also happening to people who just engage in community activism. And so this is something that is affecting the abilities of people of all walks of life to engage in speech that historically in this country we have really revered and treated as kind of a crucial part of our understanding of what makes us American. And it's coming under attack, and it affects people not just on the left, not just journalists, but people across the political spectrum who want to have a voice in the affairs of their community or their country.
At the New York Times, you're not just reporting on things, you're actually part of, you're running an investigative unit at the New York Times, and your job is to uncover wrongdoing and root it out and publish that in the paper. So these threats to you evidently are not new. You say that you realize every time you were investigating or writing about a powerful person or a powerful institution for the Times, you were bombarded with threatening letters from that person or institution's lawyer. Donald Trump has said that the laws in the United States are like a get-out-of-jail-free card for journalists. Good journalists try their best to get the facts straight, but they may from time to time get things wrong. And under our system, those harmed by what is printed or said about them in the media have to prove that the journalist did so with malice. They knew what they were saying was wrong, and they did it to hurt the person that's being attacked. Is that a fair system?
Well, to be clear, they don't have to prove that they did it with the intent to harm. They have to the plaintiff, if the plaintiff is a public figure or a public official, they need to prove that the journalist or whoever else was speaking either knew that what they were saying was false, so they were lying, or they acted with reckless disregard for the accuracy of the statement. And look, that's a high bar that the Supreme Court created, and they created it for a reason, which was that in a country where we value free speech and we think it's really important for everyday citizens as well as journalists to be able to speak critically and interrogate the affairs of powerful people, we need to have breathing room so that if we make an innocent mistake, if there's an honest, good faith screw up, we do not risk getting sued into oblivion. And the reason for that is that if people have a legitimate fear that if they make an honest mistake while writing about someone powerful, that's going to end their career, that is going to create a real chilling effect and make it much harder for people to speak truth to power. And again, this is a value that is embedded in our Constitution for the entire existence of this country. And the reason is that having people with the ability to speak up against the powerful provides a really important check on the ability of people in power to abuse that power. And so I think, look, there's an increasingly common argument, especially on the right, among people who are trying to weaken First Amendment protections for everyone, that these standards have created basically an insurmountable barrier to successful lawsuits when people's reputations are damaged. And that's simply not true. And I can tick off a bunch of examples, including very recently against CNN or against Fox News, where there have been very successful cases brought by public figures who have to meet this very high legal threshold to win. And they've done so. And they have held these news outlets and news organizations accountable for damaging their reputations wrongly. So it's just not true that that it's impossible to do.
And the one that comes to mind is the voting machine lawsuit in which Fox had to pay out hundreds of millions of dollars because they knew that what they were reporting about this one company was not factual. Bill, let me flip this a little bit on its head. What do Donald Trump and his allies say about people and institutions and events and the media? What they say is often wrong. They likely know that it is wrong. They likely intend for it to be harmful to the people and institutions that they're spreading misinformation about. Why are they then protected from promulgating a litany of untruths? Are they protected?
Well, part of it, I mean, the president is, after the immunity case that the Supreme Court decided a year or so ago, that indicating that what a president does while in office, he might be immune from any kind of accountability for that. With respect to government, often what these mistruths are do not harm a reputation, but there is no sanction against saying something that's harmful, misinformation or disinformation, unless you can show a specific harm to a particular individual. And a lot of what you're hearing on these disinformation and misinformation is that kind of statements, things that may be false but are not actionable in any sense. With respect to when members of Congress say something, if they say something on the floor of the House or the Senate, they're protected by something called the speech and debate clause. So the public officials are pretty well attuned to how to be able to avoid liability, and they do it quite well.
One of the hallmarks, David, of this country is our right to free speech, and yet free speech, although it's enshrined in the First Amendment of the Constitution, has been under attack since almost the very beginning by people in power because they don't like it. It impinges on their ability to maybe do things that are a little undercover. Are the attacks increasing? Are they coming from one side more so than the other? And if they're coming from the right more so than the other, at least that's my personal impression. Maybe it's not true.
It's definitely
why?
true.
Okay, well then why? Because conservatives are often strict constructionists for the Constitution. It's the First Amendment.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think it's kind of short-sighted by some conservatives to be pushing these arguments because it is often the right-wing media that is engaging in speech that enjoys these First Amendment protections as much as anyone. And if you strip away some of these First Amendment protections, outlets like Fox News or OAN or Newsmax are going to be in a whole heap of legal trouble, I think. But again, I think part of the reason here, and I hate to be so blunt saying this, but the fact of the matter is that the Trump administration and Trump personally have a tendency of lying, and they have often done that, and they are promoting their agenda often based on things that just aren't true. And that's a time-honored tradition from politicians in both parties. It is just factually happening more in this current administration than it has happened in the past. And having a vigorous, independent, and emboldened, incredible media that is going to call out those lies and untruths and distortions regularly, if that media is taken seriously, that poses, I think, a real threat to the ability of Trump and his administration to push their agenda. And so I think that is part of the reason that you're seeing such an aggressive war on the mainstream media from this White House. And again, that takes the form of just very vicious ad hominem attacks against individual journalists. It takes the form of lawsuits. It takes the form of investigations that government agencies are opening into news outlets. It takes the form of actions like what the White House has done to restrict the ability of the Associated Press to effectively cover the president. And you look at all these things combined, and this is it's an assault on press freedoms unlike anything we've seen since at least the Nixon era. And again, it is not a coincidence that this administration is, relying a lot on conspiracy theories and untruths. Yeah. And is also trying to really shut down institutions that are supposed to be telling the truth.
Well, for those who don't know, the Associated Press was essentially blocked from covering the White House because they refused to refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. And the Trump administration has been engaging in the erasing words and phrases from every aspect of the federal government. Through their efforts to scrub websites of words that have to do with DEI and other things. Is that, Bill, an infringement on free speech in any way?
I believe the Associated Press has a serious case there in terms of exclusion for not agreeing on something. Interestingly, one of the major lawsuits that came up in the last few years was attacked by folks on the right wing against the Biden administration for trying to get social media to remove or to not print speech that provided false information about COVID or other kinds of things. And the court has indicated, and including Sam Alito of all people, that trying to sanction trying to pressure social media into not printing kinds of things can itself be a First Amendment violation. And what we're seeing now is the Trump administration doing exactly that, pressuring media to not print things or not say things, which is a much different position that the same people took just a few years ago. Yeah. And they're doing it successfully because I think, sorry, Mike, but I think they're doing it successfully because it's not just whether you have a First Amendment right or not. It's how much it will cost you to be able to litigate that you have a First Amendment right. And that creates a major disincentive for folks, even when they have a strong case, to turn back what the administration is pressuring them to do.
And I want to talk about the expense of that because ABC, I think, settled a lawsuit involving George Stephanopoulos for about $11 million. And CBS 60 Minutes has been sued by the Trump people for the way they allegedly edited or misedited something in two versions of a comment by Kamala Harris, which I do want to talk about. Danielle, we started this conversation by airing some threats that came into Senator Thom Tillis, and they appear to be on the rise, and he's not alone in getting these threats in Congress for policies that he supports and things that he talks about. Does law enforcement try to trace these threats down to where they come from, and how successful are they?
They do try to trace it. So my understanding from Capitol Police is anytime there is a threat that is a legitimate threat, they go, they trace it, they try to figure out who started it. And Thom Tillis said, I will prosecute any person who makes a death threat against me or my family, or he wouldn't be the prosecutor, but he would take out the charge for it. So I know of two regarding Senator Tillis, one from not 2021, I think it was 2021 and 2022, where one instance they threatened to shoot him. And I believe that man was in Minnesota. Another man threatened to cut off his and his staffers' hands, and that person was also prosecuted. I don't know the number of people that are prosecuted overall with these cases, but I do know they do try to go after them.
Threatening the president, Bill, is a federal crime. Is threatening other officials in the government, like Senator Tillis and members of the House, is that also a federal crime?
My
And what would
understanding
the
is
penalty be?
yes, that it is. There is that that if you meet those requirements of a true threat, you can be prosecuted for that and found liable.
Talking about the limits of free speech this morning on Charlotte Talks here on WFAE. Bill, it's a felony in North Carolina to make threats against state level officials. Now there's a bill in our General Assembly, HB 95, which was under consideration last week, and I think has bipartisan support, which would raise the punishment for threatening local officials from a misdemeanor to a felony. Is that just to make similar threats bear similar penalties, or because local politicians in the state are getting more threats than they ever have before?
I think probably a little bit of both, to try to not create a class difference between local and state politicians and saying one is more serious than the other. And I think it's also part of what we've been talking about all along, which is that this kind of behavior, uh, whether it's increasing or not is hard to quantify, but certainly it's much more knowable now because of social media. We see it everywhere in a way that we didn't, and I think that raises the concern of the legislators in Raleigh and in Washington, D.C. about trying to do something to lower the temperature here a little bit.
On the evening of January 6th, after the insurrection, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell laid the blame for the insurrection squarely at the feet of Donald Trump. The investigation that ensued by the Congress did the same thing. His speech on the ellipse that afternoon was seen as inciting those gathered there to mount an attack on the Capitol. And Trump, of course, denies all of that. He says he did nothing of the kind. But take Donald Trump out of it. Had anyone else made a speech that resulted in people attacking the Capitol, would they have been accused, rightfully, of engaging in a speech tailored to incite violence? And would that person or persons have lost the protections of the First Amendment?
That's a really tough question, Mike, because it's very, very fact specific. It's very hard to get a conviction for incitement because you have to show a number of things. You have to show imminence. You have to show the likelihood that the violence is going to actually result. And the question with imminence is very difficult. And there's some time there between when the statements were made and when the violence took place.
And with that, we have to stop. We're coming right back. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE. It's Charlotte Talks on Listener Funded 90.7 WFAE and WFAE.org. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about free speech and attacks on free speech in America today with Danielle Battaglia, Washington correspondent for the Raleigh News and Observer. Bill Marshall is a professor of law at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And David Enrich is a business investigations editor for the New York Times and author of the new book, Murder the Truth, Fear the First Amendment, and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. David, our political discourse in the last decade has coarsened a great deal, and one of the leaders taking us down that path is you-know-who. Donald Trump. He ridicules people who don't agree with him. He belittles them. He calls them fifth-grade playground names. He brings their integrity into question. He calls them very bad people, nasty people. Now he's saying judges who rule against him are not only unfair, but should be impeached. He's called journalists and the media the enemy of the people. Is he principally responsible for raising the temperature on this rhetoric that we're hearing around the country, and the fact that politicians are now being shouted down by voters and having messages left on their voicemail that threaten their lives? Is he giving them permission to get down into the dirt?
I mean, I don't know if he's principally responsible. He definitely deserves a substantial portion of the blame. And I think that there's a lot of different forces at play here, some of which we've touched on already in this conversation. But I mean, certainly having the president of the United States engaging in playground taunts and using insults like that is a big thing. I mean, I think the rise of social media, including social media that is controlled and dominated by people who also engage in playground taunts, and I'm referring to Elon Musk there, it bears some responsibility. But I think to a certain extent, this has become a bipartisan problem. I mean, I see on both the right and the left a lot of people really kind of distilling policy disagreements and ideological disagreements into questions of whether someone is acting in bad faith, and kind of immediately assuming that the person with whom you disagree is doing so for improper reasons. And I think it's a very unhealthy and problematic trend in this country, probably in the world right now. And it makes it very, well, go ahead.
As we mentioned, people in power have quite often had a problem with free speech or free speech rights because they don't like what's being said about them or their policies. And Trump has threatened, for instance, the state of Maine with cutting off aid unless the governor there offers a full-throated apology, his words, for saying "see you in court" when he was sparring with her in the White House at a gathering. Trump has threatened, as we mentioned, CNN and MSNBC. He is suing 60 Minutes. Even if these are nothing more than nuisance lawsuits or hot air, he's threatening to curtail free speech and turn back protections by the Supreme Court, which were provided by the Supreme Court in their 1964 decision, New York Times versus Sullivan. Which is more dangerous, the threats coming from politicians utilizing free speech, or those coming from those in power trying to curtail it, David?
Well, I'm not sure I think there's a difference, really. I mean, I think what we're seeing with Trump right now and the Trump administration and its allies more broadly is that they are trying to create huge deterrent effects and penalties for institutions and individuals that speak loudly and critically of the White House. And I think I think the rhetoric is unhelpful, and I worry that it could spill over into real world effects. And there's already been violence against journalists. We're already seeing these violent threats against senators. But I think more kind of practically speaking, in the short term, the bigger risk is that the Trump administration is sending a very loud and clear message to journalists, to judges, to law firms, that to universities, that when they engage in the types of speech that this president and his administration don't like, that they are going to have to deal with very real world consequences. And sometimes those consequences, may be challenged in court. But as Bill was saying earlier, the mere act of filing a lawsuit, the mere act of pulling the plug on millions of dollars in aid, even if you win in court, it often takes years to win. And the legal expenses and other costs of doing so can be really painful. And that's especially true if you're a smaller institution, or in the case of journalists, like an independent journalist with a Substack newsletter, and you don't have a big institution like the New York Times standing at your back. And so I think the likely effect of a lot of this is that there's going to be a very real chilling effect where journalists, media companies, universities, law firms are really much more guarded in what they say and do. And to me, that cuts against the very grain of the First Amendment.
We have the press in this country, Bill Marshall, has much greater freedom than our cousins across the pond in Great Britain. They have much tighter controls on what the press can say or publish about people and institutions. And this is all because of a 1964 Supreme Court decision called the New York Times versus Sullivan. David goes into great detail into how this decision came down in his book. But if you would just give us a thumbnail of what this decision has meant for freedom of the press and free speech in this country.
Yeah, you really can't overemphasize how protective that's been. What the decision says, and David said the standard earlier, but I'll repeat it for a minute, is that in order to win, if you're a public figure or a public official, in order to win a defamation case, you have to show that the defendant knew something was false or had a reckless disregard for whether it was false or not. That's a very hard standard to reach. And if you maybe doubted something as being true, but you printed it anyway, that's not going to raise liability, even if you seriously defame somebody in the process. Now, what this means is that the press isn't chilled in what it prints, and the information gets out there quickly and in a way that is attractive to the consumers of the press. Part of the problem that we're seeing in an age of social media, however, is that the turnaround is so fast, and there's so many people doing this, that there is perhaps even more misinformation getting into the marketplace than existed at the time of Sullivan, when there were just a few major media outlets. That said, however, the chilling effect of overturning this decision would be quite considerable.
And David, your book looks at what you see as, and correct me if I'm wrong, as an attempt orchestrated by elite Americans on the right to overturn 60 years of Supreme Court precedent, to weaponize our speech laws and silence dissent. If they are successful, would we end up with rules akin to what they have in Great Britain, or would things be even more restrictive?
Well, I mean, it kind of depends on the particulars here and exactly what happens. And Britain is certainly one version of that, which is, a reasonably well-functioning democracy, but one where it is much, much harder than it is in the US to speak critically and truthfully about people in positions of power. And this has nothing to do with people actually being defamed or journalists acting recklessly. This has to do with the ability of people like Russian oligarchs, for example, to use Britain's relatively permissive legal system to punish journalists and others who speak out against them. And the one thing that I think is really worth mentioning here is that this is not about a get out of jail free card for the mainstream media. The media is imperfect. We make mistakes. We deserve to be held accountable for those mistakes. And we need to be, I think, frankly, better at being transparent when we make those mistakes. This really, though, is a question about whether in this country we want to have a robust system where individuals and institutions like the media can speak up when they see abuses of power and can really bring that to public light, or if we want to make it much easier for the people and the companies that wield that power in our country and at the local level to really shut down that type of speech.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas has made no secret of the fact that he thinks that several previous decisions by the court should be revisited, and he's encouraging people to bring cases so that can happen. Among them, New York Times versus Sullivan. And Justice Neil Gorsuch has also questioned the continuing need for the protections provided in that decision. So we have two of the four justices required to accept a new case challenging this previous decision. But yesterday, in a case involving casino owner Steve Wynn in, I think, Nevada, The Supreme Court declined to hear a challenge to New York Times versus Sullivan. So, Bill, what does that mean in the scheme of things? Are we likely to see somebody bring a suit that successfully challenges New York Times versus Sullivan, or will they simply decline the next one that comes along?
It's hard. It's always hard to predict what the Supreme Court's going to do. I agree that a couple of the justices are interested in revisiting New York Times, but I'm not sure that there are even 4 justices that want to do that, in part because it is such a settled precedent, and it is one that if you are
So was Roe v. Wade.
that's true. That's true. That's exactly right. But in this particular case, it is one that protects both right-wing and left-wing media. So it's not one that goes on one side or the other. And I think as we pointed out in this panel before, a lot of right-wing media would be subject to a great deal of liability if New York Times was overturned.
One of the things that authoritarian leaders do is they intimidate the media, they attack the media, they call into question the honesty of the media, and eventually they tamp down and control the media. And many times leading up to that, media outlets back down. It's already begun here. ABC News settled a lawsuit involving Donald Trump against a comment made by Good Morning America host George Stephanopoulos, saying that he said that a jury had found Trump liable for raping E. Jean Carroll when she had only been liable for the lesser offense of sexual abuse. Now Trump is suing CBS over the manner in which it edited a clip from an interview with Kamala Harris prior to the election. A promotional version was different from the clip that aired in the actual broadcast of 60 Minutes, which is not uncommon. It's just the way things get done, and it didn't change the intent of the comment, etc. But CBS is in the middle of trying to merge with another company, and they're being threatened by this lawsuit and considering settling it because that's going to hold up the merger. But even as they do that, 60 Minutes apparently seems to be going after the Trump administration investigatively week after week after week with Scott Pelley. Under our current laws, was the media wrong in either of these cases, Bill? And are they shooting themselves in the foot if they don't fight back?
I think they're shooting themselves in the foot if they don't fight back when they have a meritorious case. The Stephanopoulos case, I mean, there is some indication there that maybe actual malice had been achieved there, although I think that's a debatable proposition. The media companies are trying to protect themselves not just from the liability part, but being seen as an enemy of the administration. And I think that's part of where this pressure is coming in, and that is what the administration is trying to do, is create a we-they kind of view and get all of its supporters to identify those on the other side. Lawsuits are a way of doing that, even if they aren't going to be successful. So I do think, yeah, the right tact for the media corporations to take and the law firms to take and the universities to take is to fight back. But I can't overemphasize the price that they're going to have to pay in order to do that.
Danielle, bringing it back home to North Carolina for a moment, the U.S. Marshals Service has noted that threats to judges have been rising in recent years, and we know that Donald Trump has attacked not only judges, but the entire legal system, both in and out of office. So he's setting an example. But in North Carolina, the only race in the country not yet settled from the November election involves 2 people vying for a role on the state Supreme Court. One, the incumbent Democrat, Allison Riggs, who won by 734 votes, and the other by Judge Jefferson Griffin on the State Court of Appeals, who lost, but is now trying to throw out 65,000 votes with the backing of the state GOP. That case is now in the State Court of Appeals. You and others have reported both candidates have received threats. What kind of threats?
They are also receiving death threats. Both sides, both the Democrat and the Republican, have received these threats. And I hear it's stretching farther than just the 2 of them. I think members of Congress have also received death threats over this case. So it's an interesting thing to watch as they're trying to weigh out this case to see how it's affecting people's just reaction and deciding to make threats against judicial officials or candidates.
Talking about the limits of free speech on Charlotte Talks on WFAE. bill, the First Amendment, which again protects freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, is the First Amendment. If you are a strict constructionist of the Constitution, as Clarence Thomas and other conservatives on the Supreme Court proclaimed to be, you might tend to assume that the founders put that at the top of the list for a reason. Did they, or was it just happenstance?
Well, it's actually the third proposed amendment at the time. The first two didn't pass. Actually, one passed in 1992 dealing with the ability of Congress to raise its own salaries. It actually took, I think, until 1992 until it actually passed. And the other one dealt with apportionment. So the fact that it was number one now, it wasn't number one then. That said, I do think freedom of speech and freedom of religion were at the top of the framers' minds in talking about the importance of individual freedom.
Well, doesn't it undergird everything?
Yes, it does, because you cannot have a democracy without having freedom of speech.
David, if the right is successful in overturning New York Times versus Sullivan, or even if they're not, if they continue to attack media outlets and the media outlets back down because it's easier on the shareholders, essentially, will this have a trickle-down effect? Would it fundamentally change how the media covers powerful people? What impact would that have on late-night comedians, on political commentators, on ordinary Americans and their right to speak their mind?
It'll just become a lot more dangerous to do so, I think. And I think there will be there's already a lot of litigation and legal threats targeting, again, not just journalists, but everyone who speaks up against powerful people and institutions. Those threats will become much more common and much more potent. And I think people will respond rationally by doing a lot less of that kind of speech.
David Enrich is a business investigations editor at the New York Times. He's the author of a brand new book called Murder, the Truth, Fear, the First Amendment, and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. Bill Marshall joined us. He's a professor of law at UNC Chapel Hill. And Danielle Battaglia is the Washington correspondent for the Raleigh News and Observer. You can read her in the Charlotte Observer as well. Thank you all for the hour.
Thank you.
Charlotte Talks is a production of 90.7 WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from Mazda of South Charlotte. Our executive producer is Gabe Altieri. The senior producer is Sarah D'Elia. Our producer is Chris Jones. We have additional production help from Jesse Steinmetz. For more information on Charlotte Talks, to listen to past episodes, or to subscribe to the Charlotte Talks podcast, visit WFAE.org/Charlotte Talks. Additional support for WFAE programming comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.